one of the most recognisable sounds in 2016? You should probably answer that, right? I mean, it's a little distracting to say the least. In fact, it's such a distraction that it's common practice in cinemas to mute mobile phones because it detracts from the experience. But what experience are we talking about? Cinema does more than present an idea, it communicates it. It resonates with its audience. By the 21st century, it's become a social institution. You get your tickets and your popcorn, and you sit with other people with tickets and popcorn for up to 3 hours to experience a narrative of audio and visual means. But it wasn't always like this. The cinema experience began as early as 1900. Up until 1901, films and the viewing equipment toured countries, and it wasn't until 1904 that the very earliest sign of the auditorium was established for watching films, the Blacktop tent. Well, I say films, but by today's standards they would be considered a little short because, well, on average they were typically 4 minutes in length each. By this time, certain cinematic trends were beginning to take shape, as creators were finding new ways to utilise these technological wonders of cameras and projectors that resonated well with the audiences. Cinematic experiences began to improve as certain trends began to take shape. Composition played a key part in early cinema, but I was to follow, not to lead, despite many early films making this mistake. However, not all cinematic devices were accepted, as well as continuous action and shot-to-shot techniques were. By 1906, the Nickelodeon boom was in full swing, as films were now cheaper to make and distribute, and the demand from audiences was now rising. There was a connection being made between audiences and films. Fictional films, though, didn't become the most popular form of film until 1906. The narrative genre, though, was starting to make an impact. It could be argued that a cinema's auditorium is purely logical. Since films were created on the stage, it would only seem natural that they would premiere in the same way, and that the theatre and the stage were already common places for audiences to experience storytelling and narrative. 1908 and the chase genre showed us how editing played a key role in narrative film. Films were no longer one shot in length. The audience's role was no longer to connect with one shot on screen, but to stitch together a logical narrative through a series of shots that had been spliced together. But why are these approaches to cinema so effective on a psychological level? Well, Andrew Tudor would suggest a pattern of communication or asymmetric communication to be a likely explanation. Like all other forms of interaction we face in our daily lives, cinema, and the art of narrative film, is simply another stimulus. It is received by the audience, and between the two parties a very unique level of communication is shared. Consider as well that cinema is a very powerful tool of communication, like all other forms of art. And like all other forms of art, the level of communication changes as well. This is because the same film can have trillions of potential viewings from different generations of people, each person with their own varying degree of mood, their views, their opinions, even the time of day that they decide to watch the film, all making an impact. And when you multiply this across several cultures, it is easy to see the scale of communication that is happening. Andrew Tudor would suggest that in fact audiences are participant observers in a world offered to them by films. But it's not just the audience that are receiving transmissions and creating conversations. The model suggests that for there to be a sustainable level of communication, there has to be some kind of instigator. So would this be the film or the filmmaker? Film is not just a canvas but is interpreted by different people though. The canvas itself is created with thoughts in mind. It has thoughts that it wishes to convey. The composition, the lighting, the editing, and the sounds are all manipulated with the interaction in mind. In terms of narrative, however, John Ellis would suggest that narrative cinema is in fact an enigma that the audience hopes to see resolved. It builds curiosity, and this is how it's been developed. It is not only a presentation of thoughts and ideas, but it is more like a puzzle, where the audience is trying to create whatever they can extract subconsciously from the medium. There is a looming contradiction, however. You see, in Image and Influence, it is explained how isolating a single source of information strengthens its bond with an audience. The darkness and the screen achieves this with cinema. So, on a technical level, it makes sense why this was established as the norm. So, now we have two reasons, a theatrical and a technical reason, but it's most likely going to be a combination of the two. Groups watch films. The conversations in cinemas occur long after the film has ended. So not only is there a communication between the filmmaker and the audience, but we now have an intra-level of communication occurring between groups. These groups then watch films, they discuss films, they even create films. And as mentioned, groups can consist of small groups of viewers, as well as on a grander scale of generations and cultures. So if this was to be the case, then why would cinema aim to isolate its audience members? We can understand how the art of cinema has constructed itself as a social institution. Despite the hypnotic bond it creates, we go with groups because this is where the conversations physically occur, long after the film is finished. I guess you could say it's the more human side of the discussion, with the psychological side occurring in the cinema, and this is shared purely between the film and the individual. The network of communication acts like a spiral as opposed to a linear line from A to B. Like a stone in water, the ripples expand after the point of impact. The ripples act like the social communication of creating, watching and digesting films, whilst the stone acts like cinema itself. There are exceptions to these rules, however, especially when talking about narrative cinema. Cinema of attraction being a good example. It creates a strong sensual or psychological impact over diegetic absorption. BARTHES suggests that it solicits the spectator's attention, building visual curiosity through an exciting spectacle. Then there are these spectacles. Even these ideals that BARTHES is talking about still hold true today, even with modern developments of cinema that challenge the traditions of the narrative, such as 3D and virtual reality. They almost in fact replicate the very early origins of cinema. You remember how the early creators of cinema were trying to find new ways to convey messages to their audiences? Well, that never really went away, we just stopped noticing. We became accustomed to certain cinematic norms, and anything different or new just became something extra.
This probably seems quite normal as well, don't you think? Well, consider over 100 years ago, the cinema itself was even considered a spectacle. People would come from all over to get a chance of seeing the latest technological wonder.
ELLIS also suggests that the experience of TV can also show how unique and experienced cinema is to its audience. Despite appearing the same on a technical level, TV is more of an immediate reality, a broadcast of trends. It shows how, despite appearing the same on a technical level, they've both been built to satisfy different purposes cognitively. ELLIS does go on to suggest that TV hasn't tried to replicate cinema in the domestic environment. I'd consider this view slightly outdated though in today's world. The publication is almost 35 years old and this limits its applicability. I'd say that within the last decade, television has tried more and more to achieve what cinema can, with the rise of home cinema systems and on-demand streaming. The convenience this brings us is undeniable and completely logical. So why are people still going to the cinema? So something must be in films that make us want to experience them in a very particular environment. The technical and psychological levels of communication that we've discussed must elicit some kind of response that nothing yet can seem to compete with. The enigma of the narrative and its complex range of interaction is explained particularly well by BARTHES. To understand a narrative is not merely to follow the unfolding of a story, but to recognize its construction in stories. To project the horizontal concatenations of a narrative thread onto an implicit vertical axis. To read or to listen to a narrative is not merely to move from one word to the next, but to also move from one level to the next. The narrative structure is supported by the edit of the finished film, how the pieces are spliced together. Back then, it was simply to move from shot A to shot B, but now it's a lot more complex. In fact, the level of complexity in the subtext of the narrative and the edit almost match the complexity of the levels of communication that are occurring constantly within cinema. Tudor has said that the popularity of a film is weakly influenced by critical opinion. But what does this hold within a digitally connected society? People's opinions of films are as readily available as the films themselves. In fact, the digital landscape has created a new level of discussion. The difference now is the discussion never dies. There's no generational or cultural divide. There is only one discussion, an ongoing discussion that starts from now until the distant future. That comment you left on an online discussion over a decade ago, that will be cemented. And that conversation could keep on going. Another group of spectators could be exposed and they might want to leave their opinions or thoughts. The 21st century hasn't changed the traditions or the psychological impact cinema holds over us. It has simply changed the physical means by which the conversations are occurring. The level of communication that occurs within cinema, within societies, from filmmakers to film watchers is spread far and wide. Hopefully this video has communicated something to you. Besides my own words, it has hopefully left you with your own. It will act like other films and forms of art as a time capsule for the future. The discussions may change, but they will always be there. You could even suggest the discussion itself acts like a narrative that's constantly writing itself. I will leave you with one more comment from BARTHES that I find most fitting. Moreover, under this infinite diversity of forms, there is a narrative in every place, in every age, in every society. It began with the very history of mankind, and there is nowhere, is, nor has been a people without narrative. All classes, all human groups have their narratives, enjoyment of which is often shared between men and women of different, even opposing cultural backgrounds. Thanks for watching.